Hey everybody, I'm here at the Back to the Future conference, and I found two amazing people, KrisAnne Hall and JC Hall, and they are running Liberty First University. If you don't know about it yet, you need to go check it out because they have classes on the Constitution and some of what we're going to talk about today. Just incredible stuff. Thank you guys very much for being with me, and why don't we start by tell me about Liberty First University.
Well, Liberty First University is an online, learn at your own pace kind of forum. So it's streamed videos where we do American history, not revised, the actual history that happened. We do the American Constitution as those who drafted the Constitution demanded it, as they created it, proper application of the Constitution, and civics and government. And we have some faith-based classes as well. But what we teach is what our founders would have taught about American history, about our Constitution. And what we do is we overturn the false narrative today of the whole systemic racism and that everybody who was a minority was a slave, and our founders were all rich elite white slave owners who wanted to keep slavery, and the Constitution was a document of slavery. So what we do is we just lay out the facts. You know, we're not giving you our opinion, or we're not giving you our thoughts on the matter. We display the history as it is and as it existed, and let the people understand how the facts played out.
Excellent. And so you teach a class on Unsung Heroes, and I know KrisAnne talked about some of those on stage. Give us just a representative sample. Just tell us about a couple of the men and women that you teach on that really debunk these fraudulent narratives.
Yeah, so you know, the background, how I kind of came in contact with this massive history is it's incredible. The history itself is unbelievable. But you know, studying Frederick Douglass, some of his speeches and things, and I stumbled across his publisher for the North Star, William Cooper Nell, and found William Cooper Nell wrote a book called The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. And just this massive, long list of biographies and things of people I'd never heard of. And so I started digging at that prompting, and developed a presentation on this. And of course, my family background, my father's side, my great-great-grandfather is an African slave, so I was researching genealogy and that kind of thing, and it sort of hit me of what Black America has been robbed of their history, and basically been taught that American history is not your history, and you teach a whole generation to hate their own country, and not to mention you're not giving honor where honor is due to these amazing American patriots who, I mean, these are people who actually lived during slavery and accomplished great things in spite of that. And so I look at the history and think, well, what excuse does anybody have today when these people who actually had contact with slavery, unlike anyone living now, did these great things like Crispus Attucks? I like to sort of break open the conversation with people as I go along and ask them, who was the first man to give his life for every American's liberty? And well, the answer is Crispus Attucks, a Black man. And we, you know, every American should know that name. Every American should know that history. He's the first adult martyr. The Boston Massacre, what we came to know as the Boston Massacre, he was living as he ran away from slavery, had lived basically free for 20 years, was working as a whaler, merchant marine, worked in the rope making crew in Boston, as he was seeing the tyranny rise around him. And you know, people know the story, Boston Massacre, things were heating up, just absolute powder keg. And Crispus Attucks is there with the rope makers that day when the young man comes walking down the road bleeding out of the side of his head, and it was pretty much, hey, this is it. This is enough is enough. Kid just got killed 11 days ago by these guys. Here's another one again. Enough is enough. They go to confront the soldiers, and Crispus Attucks was essentially the leader in that group. There's a poem written later that talks about him being the leader, and is one to take, you know, the first bullet in the chest as he's fighting the soldiers there on King Street, and becomes the American Revolution's first adult martyr. And so first man to give his life for every American's liberty, former slave. Another one that's amazing is James Armistead Lafayette. And the thing about this, it really illustrates what's true about several of these, what I call the Black founding fathers and mothers of America, have been erased to support this agenda of division. But these guys not only were present and participated in American history, but had significant, critical, key roles. James Armistead Lafayette is one of those. He was a double agent, had infiltrated the camp of Cornwallis and Benedict Arnold. And the thing about Benedict Arnold was George Washington characterized Benedict Arnold as the greatest tactical mind on either side of the revolution, and he was incredibly popular with the troops. So a guy like that, who is a great tactician, incredibly popular with the troops, should have been devastating to the American patriot cause, but he wasn't. Why? Because of one American patriot, a black man, James Armistead Lafayette, who passed intelligence information from the camp of Cornwallis and Benedict Arnold to Washington and Lafayette, Rochambeau. So his intelligence information was key to the victory of the final decisive battle of the American Revolution, the battle at Yorktown. He's the one that fed the information to Washington so he and Rochambeau would know the movements and how to position the troops there. So you could say, if it weren't for this one single black patriot, America may not exist or certainly be what it is today. And we don't even know their names.
I have
go ahead.
I have a class called Forgotten Founders at Liberty First University where we talk less about the men, but as much about the women.
I was just going to ask you about that.
Yeah, so there's so many women out there that, just like JC was saying, though, the black patriots are instrumental in our freedom today. I mean, if you just think about it from a well thought out logical perspective, a majority of the men age 16 and up were off fighting, which meant all the towns were left in the care and control of the women alone. So the women formed their own militias. They were their own guards. They were their own people guarding their towns. So you have people like Prudence Cummings Wright, who was the captain of her militia. And she had, by the way, she was a 35-year-old mother of 6 children.
Oh, wow.
She was the captain of her militia. She had 30 women under her command. And because of their guarding of the Jewett's Bridge, the access to their town, they were actually able to capture a Tory spy and thwart a battle with what they found in his boot. You have women who were fighting. Most people think of Molly Pitcher, because that's the picture of women fighting, but they don't think about Deborah Sampson, who disguised herself as a man named Robert Shurtleff and fought for a year and a half on the front lines, so loved by the troops, not knowing that she was a woman, that when she fell ill, she was brought to the surgeon's tent, her fellow soldiers bragging on, "You've got to save Robert Shurtleff. He's the bravest man in our troops. He's the spirit of who we are. Save this man." And when the doctor went to save Robert, found out that it was Deborah, kept her secret because of the testimony of the soldiers in her battalion.
It's like America's own Mulan story.
Yeah, exactly. We do have our own Mulan story. And so the doctor kept her secret until one day the doctor's daughter, who was also a nurse in his tent, professed her love for Robert Shurtleff.
Oh, wow.
So they sort of had to come clean. But the narrative that we hear today about the women being weak, oppressed, victims, overbearing, you would think with that if that narrative were actually true, then she would have been, Deborah Sampson would have been court-martialed, she would have been outcast, but that's not what happened. She actually got a Medal of Honor, and her general gave her an honorable discharge and a full regimental pass and review, something that is only given as a highest honor for the most decorated soldiers available. We have Mercy Otis Warren, my favorite. I can't go on talking about the women if I don't talk about Mercy, right? She's the first American woman playwright, first American woman historian, first American woman political advisor. She advised Adams and Madison and Jefferson and Washington. She was their advisor. They sought her wisdom. She was an anti-federalist writer on the debates on the Constitution, very powerful one, and that her testimony of who she was, the history of who she was, completely destroys even the narrative that was given out by Ruth Bader Ginsburg when she was alive about how our founders disrespected the women and they created America to eliminate women in politics. They didn't even do that. So you have this history that is hidden from America, like JC said, with the sole and solitary purpose of making certain segments of our American population actually hate their own country and their own history.
And I'll tell you, Alex, what you realize when you get connected with this history, the black patriots, the minority patriots, the women in our founding, what you'll find is there are so many of them.
So many.
And their accomplishments are so massive, just monumental.
Absolutely.
That you understand you cannot miss that by accident.
Right.
That has to be deliberately removed from the American consciousness so that you don't know that counter narrative to the false 1619 Project type history, which is a bunch of propaganda and distortion. And because the thing about it, so I will teach the black history in the presentation I call More Than Victims, because it doesn't support the victimhood narrative. And so you get criticized, oh, well, you're just teaching a part of it, and you're trying to ignore slavery. No, let's teach about the evils of slavery. I'm not one ignoring something. I'm trying to bring in something you're deliberately hiding from the American people to promote an agenda and a narrative of hate and division and make neighbor hate their neighbor because they feel alienated from their own nation. And so that stuff that you see, and I'm not going to say their name again to give them any more publicity, but that stuff that you see over there, it is absolutely devilish and evil. I mean, I can't say it any stronger than that. It is an evil narrative because it promotes hate and division. Under a sort of false compassion label, it is really about retribution and hate.
Yeah. And that's the goal, right? Divide us into different categories. We can war with each other and bring down our country. I want to ask another question on this forgotten history. Before we started, we were talking about the history of slavery, and I mentioned Antonio Johnson, and you guys are familiar with him. So tell us a little bit about him, because the narrative that our children are taught, the narrative of the 1619 Project, is that slavery was always this racist institution. Of course, they completely eliminate the history of the African slave trade, where the Africans brought here were actually slaves in Africa. Of course, the Arab, the Muslim slave trade. But tell us about Antonio Johnson.
Well, you know what's interesting? You mentioned that we have a class at Liberty First University called Slavery and the American Founders. We actually go back to the very beginning in the 1600s, and the first slaves brought to America were not African slaves. They were English and Irish, and so they were picking up street people. They were people, and remember, if we're going to talk about Anthony Johnson, we've got to remember that prior to Anthony Johnson, everybody who was owned as a slave was not owned. They were indentured. Right. So the practice of slavery was, you come here, we pay your way, you pay off your debt, then you leave with money in your pocket and a piece of land or whatever is proper payment for the money, for the labor you've made for us. You pay off your labor, you pay off your debt to get here, you pay a little bit into a land, and then when you go, you are a landowner, you are free. So it started off as indentured, and it wasn't until Anthony Johnson, who was a black slave owner, who actually fought in the courts to make slavery a permanent institution where one man permanently owns another man.
Yeah, and I think, the idea that you talk about the indenture, that's how you end up with free Africans. So how is it, people are inherently slave if you're an African, if you have free Africans owning Africans, right? So you already had free black people who are not slaves in this country by the time we get to that point. So it tells you there's something different than the sort of narrative, this arc of, we showed up, everybody was slaves, and then we get to the civil rights movement in the 60s and, things changed. And that's just not how it happened. And I think one of the things you mentioned at the beginning that you alluded to is one of the key things to understand. Slavery was simply a worldwide phenomenon. It was just an accepted part of the human existence. Yeah. So America was not unique as in owning slaves or having slavery. It sounds to me as I listen like there's an accusation that sounds like, oh, America's so evil. This is America's original sin. It's not America's original sin. This was just world culture, no matter where you went. The difference in America, we're the only country that went to war, at least part of the reasoning for the war, to ostensibly stop slavery. So if America is so evil, how did we have this continual fight against it? With the Underground Railroad started by the Quakers and so much of the abolitionist movement that came out of the church. I mean, the abolition movement was a church movement, it's a gospel movement. So I would say we're probably a people, a nation that's fought the hardest to eliminate slavery and erase the evils of racism, and yet the narrative is to the contrary. I mean, you can look around today, there are still countries, many countries all over the world that still have slavery, and yet America is made out to be, the number one guilty party when there is not slavery, at least not racial slavery in America at this time.
Yeah, Mauritania didn't actually criminalize slavery until 2007. So, and in Libya today, you can still buy slaves at the slave market. I want to fast forward to today. We've got this imposter of a president in there who's issuing executive decrees like it's going out of style. The rule of law seems to be breaking down. It seems like our country's headed into some real tough times, but you sounded optimistic earlier. Why are you optimistic?
Well, because number one, I know history very well, and I know that throughout history there's always been a battle for liberty, and the battle for liberty is always more liberty, less government. But in order to, when you drift off into these times of complacency and compliance, Richard Henry Lee, one of our founders, called it the unavoidable intervals of inattentiveness. We lazy and luxury, complacent and compliant in our comfort. You have to get to the point where people will actually see the government as the oppressor and not the provider, right? So we have to have that that awakening of who the enemy is. The enemy is not you, it's not me, it's not my neighbor. The enemy is anybody who would take our liberty, and that's the government in their overreach of power. And so what I find encouraging, Thomas Jefferson said, people will suffer evil as long as evil is sufferable, right? So as things get worse, as the government grows bigger and becomes more and more intrusive on society, more and more destructive to the individual rights of the liberties, we're going to reach that moment in every individual's life. It has to happen individually before it can happen cumulatively, right? Where they start realizing, hey, this is not how it's supposed to be, and I need to do something about it. I need to do more than just, complain on social media. I need to actually get out and get involved in government.
So what do we do? What does an average person do who wants to get involved? What are your recommendations? I mean, everybody's got different gifts, talents, but what's a good place to start?
Starting with education, right? Because we've been taught the wrong things for a really long time. And I always tell people, unless you were born before 1885, what you've received in education is tainted at best. So we need to learn the standard of the Constitution. We need to learn the standard of natural rights and liberties so that we can weigh what we see in public today against that standard. Not the standard of the textbooks, but what actually is the standard for government and for natural rights and life. So once we understand that standard, that proper education, then we can organize each other and then get activated in the right direction. So it's always education, organization, activation with persistence.
And Liberty First University, you guys are teaching a lot of this. How do people get involved in that? How do you get plugged in? What's the website?
Yeah, libertyfirstuniversity.com. And you can actually go there and find a free course, a sample course that you can take and see how it's done, see what the content looks like, see what you think. And then it's a small subscription for the education after that, and you can make your decision whether it's valuable to you or not. I think, as KrisAnne said, I always tell people it's not really KrisAnne teaching. She's just putting the founders on a platform and giving them a voice. And so that's how we try to teach. Go to first source information. Not telling you what somebody thinks about the Constitution and our founding documents, but what are the people who actually wrote those documents? What did they think? What did they say? And that's how we try to come at what we teach.
That's awesome. And you guys also have a podcast?
Yeah.
Where can people find that?
You can find that at KrisAnneHall.com, KrisAnneHall.com. And we do that Monday through Friday, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're actually going to be doing it in a few minutes. We're on YouTube, Facebook, DLive, Twitch, and there are segments of that on BitChute, right?
Okay.
And then we are also on audio platforms like Spotify, iTunes, Google, and all those, Samsung, all that kind of stuff, yeah.
Excellent. Well, KrisAnne, JC, thank you guys so much for what you're doing. Folks, KrisAnne Hall, JC Hall, Liberty First University, thanks for watching, and please share this out. You know the social media companies don't like us. We depend on you to get the information out. Thanks, and God bless.